Yeah.
So as we're waiting for other people to trickle in, since it is 6 minutes after 12, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Trin Dang, Executive Director of NAMI Southern Nevada. So I just want to thank everyone so much for taking the time today to join us for a really important topic. And we're thankful to Milton Jones, our newly elected NAMI Treasurer, who's going to be our moderator today, and also Dr. Crabb for taking the time to put this presentation together for us on becoming racially trauma informed. So it is Minority Mental Health Month, and we do have special population meetings going on throughout the month. Tonight, we'll also have a Native American and Indigenous meeting just to share some information on what the cultural views are from that culture as far as mental health goes at 5:30. If you sign up for our text messaging platform, we'll give you reminders for updates on events such as these or the one that's happening tonight. We also have it in our voice presentation taking place this Friday, where you get to hear people with lived experience speaking about their own mental health journey and recovery, as well as a painting event coming up in August. So if you text NAMI Vegas to the number 725-7575, you'll be able to join and get some updates from our programs. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Milton. So you can go ahead and introduce yourself, Milton, and then Dr. Crabb will be on her way with her webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Sounds good. Thanks, Trin. Hi, everybody. I'm Milton Jones. I am a part of the NAMI organization, Southern Nevada. And like she said, just newly elected treasurer to the executive board. So I'm excited. This is my first experience. So what we're going to do is just give a little bit of the housekeeping, but before that, I just forgot to introduce the rest of myself. So I am a MFT and CPC intern licensed in the state of Nevada. So I actually see clients and things like that, and joining the NAMI organization fit right into part of my career pathing and things like that as well. So love the organization. They have a lot of great stuff. One of the things I do want to let you guys know is that we are a nonprofit. So anytime you can donate or join our organization as a member, it helps out a lot. So if you were to join, it's only $5 for the first year, and then $40 each year after if you decide to do that, or if you just want to donate, because we do a lot of different things for the community and things like that. So every little bit counts. And so please, if you have an opportunity to donate, please do. So just a couple of things on housekeeping. You have a chat box that you will not be able to use, but we do have a Q&A box that will be enabled. As far as the Q&A goes, is you guys will ask questions as we do the presentation, and then we will actually get to those questions at the end, so we can have Dr. Crabb do her piece and things like that. As we get to the end, when we go through their questions, you will have also a choice to be anonymous when you post your questions. If you want to be anonymous, make sure that you click the anonymous button. Or if you decide you're okay with it, just not being anonymous, then whatever your sign-in was, then that will be what shows up as who asked the question. So it's completely up to you. And then lastly, when we get to the end and we start asking questions, you can either type as well additional questions, or you can do a vocal question. So you will be able to click on it, say your question, everybody will be able to hear you, and hopefully we'll be able to get an answer for you in regards to your question. So without further ado, here is Dr. Crabb.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Tanya Crabb, CAP Psychology. I working at UNLV. CAP stands for Counseling and Psychological Services. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in there. Okay. So today's presentation is called Becoming Racially Trauma Informed. Some disclaimers. I am not affiliated with, or actually let me reframe that. I am representing myself, my experiences, my identity as a Black woman, my experiences and my knowledge as a psychologist. This presentation is not a representation of CAP's perspective. It's not a representation of anyone's perspective other than my own. I'm not affiliated with or being paid by any organization to give this talk. Disclaimer number 2. So I will be presenting a number of different resources from a variety of sources that I've gathered putting together the presentation. Just because I show a resource doesn't necessarily mean that I'm affiliated with or that I am endorsing a particular organization or information. It just shows that the information that I'm presenting was interesting and I thought was useful, so I included it. All right, let's get going. So today, our agenda consists of defining racial trauma, factors contributing to racial trauma. We're going to talk about the impact of racial trauma and what it means to become racially trauma informed. The objectives, as stated, were to define racial trauma, understand the roots of racial trauma, understand the impact of racial trauma, and understand how to become a racially informed individual or clinician if that's the case. Before we get started, I'd just like to touch on a few things. The subject of racism is emotionally charged. That being said, during this presentation, it's likely that you may feel any number of emotions to include anger, fear, guilt, defensiveness, sadness, hopelessness, shame, resentment, dissociation even, and resolve. I just want you to know that as these experiences and feelings come up for you, that they are perfectly natural and normal in the course of talking about something that's so emotionally charged. So in keeping that in mind, I'd like to talk about some rules of engagement. So I'm assuming that everyone that is in this space is in this space because they want to develop a better understanding and to become better informed and to become better advocates and allies for people in the fight against racial injustice. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about some rules of engagement. First things first, we'd like this to be a safe and liberating space, meaning that people feel free to share their ideas and thoughts around race without feeling like they might be attacked for having a perspective. The hope is that we can treat each other with mutual caring and respect, and just remember that we're all here to learn and grow. That being said, it's important to pay attention to our discomfort around issues regarding race and to take accountability for our words. We seek not to be attacked, but we also seek not to provoke. So the objective is to respond rather than to react. And we're going to try not to engage in personal attacks. If at any point during this discussion, this becomes a difficult topic to either hear, listen to, or respond to in a thoughtful way, it's okay to step away. It's okay to take a moment and say, you know what? I can't do this. I need a breather. I need a timeout. Self-care is recommended. Self-care is endorsed. If you need to do it, no judgment to be had. If you just need to shut off your camera or shut off your mic and just step outside the room for a minute. All right. So today, the hope is to move from a place of fixed comfort and growth when it comes to anti-racism. So comfort says, I don't know what to say or where to start. Courage says, I will listen, read, watch, and I will speak against injustice. Comfort says, but I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to get called out. Growth says, I will make mistakes. No doubt about it. But I will be grateful for the lesson. Comfort says it won't make a difference. Nothing is going to change. Growth says things happen when I take risks and become part of something bigger. Comfort says I don't get involved in politics. I don't have time. Growth says this is a human rights issue. This matters and I will make time. So first thing I want to do is define what racial trauma is. Now, my definition of racial trauma is living in a continuous state of fear. That's not the technical definition, but as we go through the slides, I will sort of give you an idea of why that is my definition. But we're going to talk about the technical definitions of racial trauma, or race-based traumatic stress, as it's called in some areas, intergenerational trauma, as well as the factors that are contributing to this thing that we call racial trauma, and how racial trauma shapes and shakes out in terms of the Black community. So first things first, definition. Racial trauma is a form of race-based stress, refers to people and indigenous individuals of color, reactions to dangerous events, real or perceived experiences of racial discriminations. Such experiences may include threat of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing racial discriminations towards other POCs or Indigenous people. Such experiences can include harm and injury, humiliating and shameful events, and witnessing racial discrimination towards other people of color and Indigenous people. Although similar to PTSD, racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries due to exposure and re-exposure to race-based stress. That's the definition, the operational definition that we're going to be working with. So intergenerational racial trauma. So racial trauma has an intergenerational effect, as experiences of racism are often shared in public and in private forums. I believe that that's even more evident now as we are bearing witness to a whole host of racial trauma that's happening throughout our country, either through our personal or private settings, or even in public spaces like the news. Transmitted traumatic stressors refer to traumatic stressors that are transferred from one generation to the next. These stressors can come from historically racial sources or maybe personal traumas passed down through families and communities. So the idea behind racial trauma is it's not a one-stop situation. It's not just a one person. It can actually involve families and generations of people who have experienced these racial slights. So I also want to talk about the difference between prejudice and racism. Prejudice typically involves individuals. Racism is the individuals plus the systems in place and in power that cause these disadvantages to people of color. Okay, before I get started on this piece, I just have to say that this particular part of the slide can feel heavy. As we look at the statistics and the factors impacting Black people in particular around racism, a lot of these numbers are daunting, but they're important to be shared. They're important to be seen so that people can understand that when we discuss racism, we're not talking about individual behavior, we're talking about a collective behavior. We're talking about laws and institutions that are put in place to oppress. So let's talk about the impact of racism. Racism shapes up in a variety of different ways in terms of the lives of Black people. One of the ways that it shows up is in a loss of resources. Studies have shown that white families hold 90% of national wealth versus 2.3% for Latino families, 2.6% for Black families. And for every $100 white families earn in income, Black families earn about $57.30. As we're looking at resources, let's talk about household wealth. Blacks are more than twice as likely to be poor. In 2014, about a quarter of Blacks were poor compared to 10% of whites. Now, I just want to be clear about these numbers. This isn't a question of circumstances and situation. This is a question of foundational wealth, meaning that even when economic situations change, the disparity still exists. Some more about household wealth. In 2013, the net worth of white households was $144,200, roughly 13 times that of Black households. Children of white households in the bottom 25% of the income distribution were more likely than children from Black households at the bottom to move into a higher income bracket. So this lack of resources, this loss of resources doesn't just impact the original people, it also impacts the families and the generations to follow. So that wealth is not being transmitted down the line. So that disadvantage gets shared through the generations. Loss of opportunity. And this is one slide in particular that was really interesting and unsettling, because this is sort of a description of what's called the school to prison pipeline. How Black children start out being criminalized and end up into these institutions and end up in jails. While Black children constitute 18% of preschoolers nationwide, Black students are 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended for the same infractions. Overall, Black students represent 16% of student enrollment and 27% of students referred to law enforcement. Once Black children are in the criminal justice system, they're 18 times more likely than white children to be sentenced as adults. Loss of opportunities around housing. Blacks are shown 18% fewer homes and 4% fewer rentals than their white counterparts. Black ownership is now at an all-time low of 44% compared to 72% for whites. Loss of opportunities in employment. Black employment rate was consistently twice that of whites, irrespective of economic conditions. So even as the economy improved, the job outlooks for Blacks did not improve. So sometimes the argument is, well, it's a question of education and preparedness. Well, apparently not, because Blacks with college degrees are twice as likely to be unemployed compared to all other graduates. In 2018, the average Black worker earned 62% of what the average white worker made. And the loss of opportunities starts even before you walk through the door. As they've done studies to show that individuals with white sounding names were 50% more likely to receive a job callback. Loss of freedom. These figures are actually quite staggering, especially when you look at the age range of the population that's in prison and the 12.7 times more likely for Black males ages 18 through 19. So in addition to impacting just Black trajectory in terms of finances, think about the fact that these are the age ranges where most families are getting started, where people are starting to build their own families and start to build their own economic wealth. So if you're incarcerated, that puts you at a disadvantage financially to begin with because you're not making income, and then compounds the disadvantage because then you're not able to be employed. So more than half of all young Black Americans know someone, including themselves, who has been harassed by the police. Black drivers are 30% more likely to be pulled over. Black people are convicted more often than white people arrested for the same crime. Black people are then more likely to be sentenced to incarceration compared to whites convicted of the same crime. And this is a major one, loss of life. So there's been a lot of conversations around the idea that more white people are killed by the police than Black people. Okay, if we're talking sheer numbers, then that makes sense. But if we're talking in terms of percentages, the disparity is very stark. If you have, let's talk racism math here. If you have 10 people and you lose one person, you've lost 1/10 of your people. If you have 3 people and you lose one person, that's 1/3 of your population. So when we talk about loss of life by police violence, we need to actually consider not just the numbers, but the percentages in terms of what the representation is of the population of those particular groups. So that being said, roughly half of those fatally shot by police are white, but Black Americans are fatally shot at a disproportionate rate compared to their representation in the US population. So taking into account all those factors and all those disadvantages and all those disparities that exist for Blacks in America, it should not be difficult to understand why they would be experiencing racial trauma. So some of the traumatic stressors that we discussed: violence or victimization by institutions of law enforcement, court corrections, being racially profiled, interrogated, followed, marginalized, being denied access and opportunity because of race, disparities in healthcare, housing, education, employment, experiencing microaggressions and macroaggressions, micro-invalidations and micro-insults. Some more indirect stressors or vicarious stressors are witnessing violence perpetrated against Black people, witnessing examples of police killings of Black people, high rates of societal homicide, suicide, and unintentional injury experienced in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. I want to take a moment to show you a video that I think really encapsulates the idea of a traumatic stressor or racial traumatic stressors when it pertains to Black people.
Wake up! Let's say they listen to the cops and get in the car. Look what happened to Freddie Gray.
Yeah, and what if they make it all the way to the station? You remember Sandra Bland?
And let's say they do make it to trial. You see where that gets us? Don't you get it, Bo? The system is rigged against us.
Maybe it is, Dre. But I don't want to feel like my kids are living in a world that is so flawed that they can't have any hope.
Oh, so you want to talk about hope, Bo? Obama ran on hope. Remember when he got elected? And we felt like maybe, just maybe, We got out of that bad place and made it to a good place. That the whole country was really ready to turn the corner. You remember that amazing feeling we had during the inauguration? I was sitting right next to you. And we were so proud. And we saw him get out of that limo and walk alongside of it and wave to that crowd. Tell me you weren't terrified when you saw that. Tell me you weren't worried that someone was going to snatch that hope away from us like they always do. That is the real world, though. And our children need to know that that's the world that they live in. Let's finish watching. Let's see what they're going to say next.
So in that one clip, we got to see the full sum and weight of the trauma that's experienced with Black people as it's passed down and shared to future generations. I ran across this on, Facebook, where all interesting things end up. And it just really struck me, about the full limitations of being Black in America. We can't go jogging. Ahmaud Arbery. We can't relax in the comfort of our home. Botham Jeans, Atiana Jefferson. We can't ask for help after being in a car crash. Jonathan Ferrell, Renisha McBride. We can't have a cell phone, Stephen Clark. We can't leave a party to get to safety, Jordan Edwards. We can't play loud music, Jordan Davis. We can't sell CDs, Anton Sterling. We can't sleep, Aiyana Jones. And Breonna Taylor, by the way. We can't walk away from the corner store, Mike Brown. We can't play cops and robbers, Tamir Rice. We can't go to church, Charleston 9. We can't walk home with Skittles, Trayvon Martin. We can't hold a hairbrush while leaving our own bachelor party, Sean Bell. We can't party on New Year's Eve, Oscar Grant. We can't get a normal traffic ticket, Sandra Bland. We can't carry a weapon, Philando Castillo. This is why my definition of racial trauma is living in a constant state of terror. The common thought is, if racists are kneeling on necks in broad daylight, imagine what they're doing in HR departments, classrooms, and medical offices around the country. We know it's bigger than just the police. Racism, and maybe it's because of the things that are happening currently around the Black Lives Matter movement, because I feel like there's a little bit of a difference this time in how the country is responding to racism. But racism has been declared a pandemic by the APA. What's interesting is, for Black people who've been suffering through racism for many, many years, we've always been aware that this pandemic exists, but this pandemic then gets compounded by other pandemics around things like health disparities, which is really showing up in spaces and places around COVID-19. So let's talk about what racism and racial trauma looks like in terms of how we carry it in our lives and how it shows up in our bodies. So I want to point out that one line: racism is associated with a host of psychological consequences, including depression, anxiety, and other serious, sometimes debilitating conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use disorders. So this is what racial trauma looks like. It has an emotional, psychological, and physical effect on the people of color. So it could be sleep disturbances, nightmares, insomnia, night terrors, disrupted sleep patterns, hypervigilance, emotional agitation, depression, anxiety, anger, fear, helplessness, hopelessness, difficulty regulation emotion, racism fatigue. And I'm going to touch on racism fatigue a little bit later because I want to expand on what that means. Poor self-care, PTSD, somatic complaints, including chest pain, stomach aches, headaches, eating too much or too little. And, as professionals, we also realize that trauma has an impact on not only the body, but also on the brain. It changes brain development. It changes the way that your brain responds to circumstances. It can be passed down through genetics. So it results in things like increased cortisol levels, which result in weight gain and muscle weakness and slow recovery from illness, increased heart rate, and increased likelihood of cardiovascular disease. So racism is in essence killing us, emotionally and physically, internally and externally. So we're exposed to different kinds of racism, historically, collectively, institutionally, systematically, interpersonally, generationally. We inherit a lot of this. For Black people in particular, racial stress is something that happens throughout their life course. The conversations around race as a Black person in America begin before you can even understand who you are in this world. And for many, it sadly happens before birth, in those genes transmissions that we talked about, in the parental stress that we talk about. This is the intergenerational effect of racial trauma. The children of parents who have been exposed to racial trauma become more sensitive to it. Being Black is having a good day and then seeing another Black person that was killed for no reason. Then you have to think about it, talk about it all day, or don't, and numb yourself. It's a constant emotional war. I feel like this is even more the case now with the Black Lives Matter movement, because it is everywhere, all day, all the time. It's impossible to not be aware of the instances of Black people dying around you when it is frequently the conversation of the news and social media. We can't fully heal from the trauma when we are still being terrorized. So, before I get going, I just want to say we're transitioning to the next part of the program. One of the things that I noted when talking about racism and even preparing this slide is there's this pervasive sense sometimes of helplessness around racism. It seems like a really big issue that's going to be impossible to tackle. So I want to just give you guys some tools on how to maybe help with this issue around racism and racial injustice. So the steps to becoming racially trauma-informed include awareness, alliance, and action. That first half that we talked about just now had a lot to do with awareness. Just being aware of racism as a construct, being aware that racism is a real thing and not an imagined thing by Black folks in America, being aware that racism is pervasive and broad and wide, and being aware that racism needs to change on an institutional and systematic level and not just on an individual level. So awareness starts with recognizing and acknowledging that racism is a real problem. And in order to do this, it requires educating yourself about race and systemic racism.
One thing that I wanted to research, so.
Identifying the way racism has benefited white individuals, understanding privilege, and there are various levels of privilege, and acknowledging the biases and knowledge gaps. Some examples of racism include prejudice and overt bias, stereotyping, racial profiling, macroaggressions, and microaggressions. And we'll get into macro and microaggressions further on. So macroaggressions, here are just some broad examples of what microaggressions look like in the world. Statements like, you act white, but you're not really Black. You're an Oreo. I wish I was tan like you. We're also going to talk about coded language and how the language of racism is actually pretty woven into the fabric of our lives in terms of how we talk to and about each other. So a macroaggression is a potential large-scale or overt acts of aggression and disrespect that are directed towards those of a different race, culture, gender, religion, or other sociocultural identity. The thing about macroaggressions that makes them stand out is that they're pretty easy to know. Wearing a swastika mask to go shopping would be a macroaggression. No one is like, oh, what was that? Macroaggressions tend to be more in your face type of racist acts. They're typically readily identifiable given their presentation. Now, microaggressions. Microaggressions are a little bit more complicated. So microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostility, derogatory or negative racial slights and insults to the target person or group. Microaggressions typically show up when other rationales can be offered. That's the tricky thing about microaggressions, is that oftentimes they're hidden under other excuses. Oh, I was just kidding. Oh, I didn't mean it like that. And the thing about microaggressions is that over time, people get so accustomed to saying or using them that they don't even realize they're doing them. So most offensive actions are not gross and crippling, they're subtle and stunning. The thing about microaggressions that makes them difficult is that they're insistent. Like, they are ongoing, consistent ways of speaking to people of color that are insulting and demeaning. The cumulative effect to the victim and to the victimizer is of an unimaginable magnitude. Oftentimes, aggressors will attempt to avoid taking responsibility for their actions because they claim the offense was not intentional. Regardless of the intent, the aggressor, what matters most is the impact that the racist microaggression and macroaggression have on the target. So sometimes I guess a microaggression could be referred to as misspeaking, but at the end of the day, it's not about what was misspoken. It's about the impact that it had on the person who you were speaking to. Microaggressions happen so frequently and so often that oftentimes people won't even notice that they've said them because, as they said in the first slide, they're conditioned. Let me give you some examples. Aliens in one's own land, which is assuming a non-white person is foreign-born. Questions like, where are you from? What are you? Ascriptions of intelligence, assigning intelligence based on race and culture. Telling a Black person, oh, you're so articulate, or an Asian person, or any other ethnic group, you're a credit to your race. Colorblindness, failure to acknowledge someone's race or culture. I don't see color. The only race is the human race. See, those statements are problematic because if you don't see color, you don't see me, because that is part of my identity. Criminality, assumption of criminal status, assuming a person of color is a criminal, deviant, or dangerous based on their race. Locking a door or clutching a purse when a person of color approaches, or even pushing an elevator button to make sure that it closes before the person of color can get in. Following someone around a store, or statements like, can I see your ID? Or do you belong here? Do you live in this neighborhood? Myth of meritocracy, refusal to acknowledge the role of racism in achievement. Statements like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. When, as demonstrated by the slides in advance of this slide, some of us weren't issued boots. Others don't have laces. This idea that somehow the only thing you need to be successful in America is grit. Pathologizing cultural values, communication styles, assumption that the dominant white culture of communication standards are ideal. And I see this a lot when people visit foreign lands and show up in, say, France or Italy or Germany and demand that everyone speaks English. Or saying things to a person who their culture is expressive, like, why are you talking so loud? Why are you so quiet? To someone who's Asian, who their culture may not necessarily dictate that they speak loudly, or just speak English. Denial of individual and systemic racism, failure to acknowledge the impact of racial biases. I'm not racist. I have several Black friends. I'm married to a Black person. You know, I work with Black people. Just because you have those relationships, it does not mean that you are immune from having racist ways. All lives matter. Or I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. Oh, no, actually I didn't. All lives matter, or white people saying that they've experienced racism too. To say that a white person has experienced racism is almost a denial of the fact that racism as it exists in America is not something that gets experienced by white people. Second-class citizenship, giving preferential treatment to white customers or consumers or clients, or assuming a person of color is a service worker or store employee, or jumping ahead of the line to get your needs met instead of someone of color who's standing in front of you. Environmental microaggressions like non-representation in spaces and places, to include media, to include offices, to include decor that highlights one specific culture over another. Yeah, and I'm really sad to say that I've experienced probably all of these in the course of my life. Over-identification, minimizing or denying individual racial biases because of assumed similarity. As an X, Y, or Z, I know just what it's like. I know what you're going through. I know what that experience is like. Idealization, overestimating desirable qualities and underestimating the limitations of a person based on racial or ethnic group membership. I'm sure you can cope with those problems as a strong Black woman, or this over-identification in the Black culture. Oh, Black people are so cool. I wish I was Black too. Stereotypic assumptions about a member of a racial or ethnic group, assuming a person's characteristics or norms is due to their identity. I know that Black people like to do, eat, etc. Did you grow up in the hood without a dad? Were you poor growing up? Assigning unique or special status based on race and ethnicities. Basing your expectations about a client's background based on their skin color. Or if they don't align with that, you're not like the other XYZ. Stereotypic assumptions about members of a dysfunctional health, I'm sorry, I double wrote that one. What this one should say is patronizing people of color, offering help that is unneeded or inappropriate. Accusing people of color of being hypersensitive around racial and cultural issues. You know, when it's a matter of life or death, there is no such thing as being sensitive around an issue. I'm going to give you a small video to show you some other types of microaggressions that exist.
Do you speak African? Aren't you from the hood?
Can I have your hair?
So your dad's the Black one, right?
Why do you talk like a white girl?
What do you mean you can't play basketball?
You speak Spanish, you're not Black.
Why are you such an angry Black woman? Can you even comb your hair?
Definitely.
Is it true what they say about Black guys? Hey, what sport do you play?
I thought you were just Black.
Why do you act so Black?
Hey, girlfriend.
What country in Africa are your parents from?
Call me Bobby. Oh my gosh, you're so pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Can I see your ID?
How's the Black perspective? Fake. Oreo.
Swirl.
One drop.
White girl.
Homie.
Exotic. Sassy. Nappy.
Nigga.
So that last thing was more of a macro than a microaggression. So I want to also point out that microaggressions aren't always spoken. And this video does a really good job of illustrating that. So as the video demonstrated, actions are also can also constitute microaggressions. Some other examples: I wish I had dark skin like you, I'm so pale. Touching a person of color's hair, I wish I could do that, wear an afro, use Black slang, sing the N-word. Mimicking Black stereotypical cultures. Hey girlfriend, you go girl. Statements like, I've got a tan, we're almost the same color now. Don't make race a political issue. I didn't realize you were Black when you spoke on the phone. I didn't hear the ghetto in your voice. Why do Black people always, I'm not racist, my blank is Black, or I have Black friends. So I wanted to take a second, and I realize that we're doing the Q&A at the end, but I want you to think about what are some of the microaggressions that you have personally experienced and or witnessed. As I go through that list, that last list was my list that I've actually experienced myself, and one of them was one of the things that my son has actually experienced. I have one more video relating to microaggressions that I think it's really important to show how microaggressions show up in the workspaces and places and what they can mean for people of color.
So I talk to people a lot about establishing a diverse and inclusive work environment and creating a culture where people feel free to be themselves, to take up space, I say, right? When I use the word take up space, I mean, if you feel passionate about a topic, you can have big gestures and be a woman or be a person of color, or, you know, have a quiver in your voice and be a woman and not have to worry about all of the stereotypes and assumptions that will be made on you based on your gender or your race or your religious background. You can take up space and be exactly who you are, free from all of the baggage associated with the stereotypes affixed to who you are. When people use coded language about why certain groups of people can access certain resources and other folks that have concerns about other folks accessing those resources, they're usually playing into the stereotypes that are affixed to your group that you're a member of. So for me, as a Black woman, I'm angry, emotional, volatile, tardy, right? Lazy, sometimes criminal, loud, brazen. I mean, there are many, many, many stereotypes that are associated with me just based on the skin that I have, based on the gender that I was born with. Those things exist. This is not an extreme example. The loaded language associated with it is, I had a conversation with Cyrilda and I was afraid. I'm afraid to go and have a conversation with Cyrilda. If I tell Cyrilda that I don't like what she did in her, you know, in her presentation, she's gonna lash out at me. That's loaded language. Where is that coming from? Has she demonstrated that she's actually gonna do anything of that nature? Or is it just because she's got big gestures? Is it just because she's got an afro that automatically elicits fear in you? Those things manifest into policy. Those feelings manifest into rules and regulations that are oppressive to people like me. And I can give you a million of those examples, but they happen all day long. And human resources has got to be charged with interrupting that, digging deeper, asking questions like, has she ever demonstrated that if you give her feedback, she's going to lash out? Has she ever demonstrated that if she works from home, she doesn't work at all? HR has got to facilitate the deeper dive into what's happening inside the person who owns and harbors those assumptions and biases. And they also got to facilitate the coming together of the two people who are from different cultures, different backgrounds, different genders, to explore where the rub is, where the discomfort is. Because if you, the person who's in power, are uncomfortable with that individual, there's probably some discomfort on the side of the person who doesn't have any power when it comes to relating to you.
Okay, so she mentioned coded language. So coded language are phrases and words that are targeted at a specific group, so often they just become commonplace. Take, for example, thug to refer to Black people, or menacing to refer to a certain population, or urban, vicious, real Americans, go back to your country, manifest destiny. The use of the term explorer versus colonizer are some examples. Some other examples include things like, wait, I'm sorry, let me go through this first. So the problem with coded language is that they become used so often that they start to substitute for saying something about a person of color. So now when you say thug, you think Black. When you say hood, you think Black, versus the actual definition of the word. Some coded language terms include underrepresented minorities, which, you know, people of color really aren't minorities in the world. They're minorities in colonized parts of the world. Grit, which is this pull yourself up by the bootstraps sort of mentality where you just need to work a little bit harder and things will be great for you. Achievement gap. The achievement gap isn't really a thing. It's more like certain populations are underfunded and that they have less access to certain resources than other places do. Under-resourced is another way of describing marginalization. So some tips for recognizing racism: racial or stereotypical stereotypes or comments, shifting or contradictory or non-existent explanations for why a person was targeted. Things like, well, if they'd complied, it would have gone differently, or they fit the description, or we don't know the full story yet. Deviations from normal protocol or practices or unprofessional behavior, systems that apply for one person but don't apply for another, different treatment or outcomes for white individuals in similar circumstances, things like disparities in sentencing, disparities in hiring, disparities in loan applications granted. Something to remember as we move towards awareness is no matter how open-minded, socially conscious, anti-racist I think I am, I still have old, learned, hidden biases that I need to examine. It is my responsibility to check myself daily for my stereotypes, prejudice, and ultimately discrimination. Some resources for anyone who wants to increase their awareness. Don't worry, we will share these in the next email about this program. Some more resources. Oh, and I included this because representation matters. Awareness doesn't just start with the adults, it starts with the children and including people of color in spaces and places that normalize people of color as regular human beings instead of just athletes or entertainers or criminals. So now that we've talked about awareness, let's talk a little bit about how we become allies for Black folks and people of color. So one of the most important steps to alliance is listening to and validating the experience of people of color, which means that seeking answers to those questions that are uncomfortable around biases and privileges, and also using privilege in public and private spaces to call attention to racism and to amplify the voices of people of color. Meaning that, you know, it's not just important to speak about it in a march, it's important to speak about it in a boardroom, it's important to speak about it at a barbecue. It's important to use your privilege to get into those places and spaces where people of color cannot get into. That includes asking your friends and families to step up. And what that means is becoming educated about systemic racism and microaggressions, which we started that journey today. Becoming educated about racism and mental health, because racism doesn't just show up in boardrooms, it shows up in doctors' offices, it shows up in banks. Not relying on Black friends and family members or clients to educate you about racism, because that's not their role and it's not their job. And the resources have existed for hundreds of years. There's so many resources. You'll see at the end around becoming anti-racist that there's no shortage of information out there. Becoming aware of minimizing microaggression and gaslighting that may occur. Holding friends and family members and colleagues accountable for racist behaviors, not letting that joke slip and slide by, calling that question out, calling that statement out, seeking support or supervision or consultation when necessary. Sometimes it's gonna be necessary to reach out to people who have a little bit more experience with dealing with these matters. Advocating for diversity in spaces where there's an absence of people of color, and that could be something as simple as a PTA meeting or on the board of a company that you serve. And committing to long-term change, because the work of fighting racism is it's not a quick fix. You know, this fight has been going on for a really long time. Some other things to consider. Have you ever actively addressed the impact of racism with anti-racism when you had nothing to gain from it? And when I say when you had nothing to gain from it, I mean when you did not have a personal relationship with the individual involved in this instance, whether it's a colleague, a friend, or otherwise. When you saw something wrong at the grocery store, were you inclined to step in and do something about a racial slight that happened at a grocery store? Or is it only when it becomes a personal matter that we start to lean into these things? another one of my wonderful Facebook finds. Agree to disagree is reserved for things like I don't like coffee, not racism, homophobia, and sexism, not human rights, not basic common decency. If I unfriend you during this, it is personal. We have a difference of opinion. We don't have a difference of opinion. We have a difference in morality. And, you know, honestly, in the advent of everything that's been going on in this world, I can honestly say that people have fallen by the wayside as I've come to understand and to see them in ways that are different through the lens of racism. In order to be an ally, you just need some basic characteristics: mouth to speak against injustice, a nose to recognize bias and microaggressions, eyes to identify privilege, ears to listen to POC experiences, a heart to cultivate empathy for the oppressed, and hands to take action and willingness to make a change. You can choose courage or you can choose comfort. You cannot have both. So with that, I'm going to slide into how the actions that are required in order to become more racially trauma informed. And we're going to start with some things like the guidelines for being strong white allies, what not to say to someone who has experienced racial trauma, and how you move from awareness to alliance and action. And then we're going to touch on self-care during a collective crisis, because as we do this really hard work, it's really important to take care of ourselves so that we can continue to do the work that is necessary. So, number one, assume racism is everywhere, every day. And you know, as the previous slides demonstrated, racism isn't just a one-person thing. It's a systemic thing that's woven into the fabric of America. It's part and parcel of how we came to be. So it touches in almost every area of life. Notice who's the center of attention and who's the center of power. Notice how racism is denied, minimized, and justified. And I see this all the time with conflicting news reports, or how we sort of try and deflect onto other subjects around it instead of focusing on the issue, which is racial injustice. Understand and learn from the history of whiteness and racism. This work around anti-racism is not brand new. You know, abolitionists were a big part of the original movement to end slavery. So understand how whiteness feeds into racism. Understand the connections between racism, economic issues, sexism, and other forms of injustice. Racism is more than just racism. As I stated earlier, it touches on impacts on so many different areas of life. Take a stand against injustice, whatever that means for you. So that for some that would mean going to a march, for some that would mean trying to change the systems that they work with. One thing I'd like to really, really stress, one of the most important things you can do is vote. Use your voice in those spaces as well. Be strategic. Don't engage in a fight with the woman down the street when the real issue are the seats of power. Take an opportunity to look into trying to change those seats of power rather than argue over a statement that was made. You can still address that, but don't be distracted. Don't confuse the battle with a war. There are a lot of little skirmishes taking place. The war is against anti-racism. Don't be a jerk. You know, don't become the person that you're trying to argue against with name calling or personal abuse. Support the leadership of people of color. And when I say support the leadership of people of color, I want to say be mindful about who you choose to support. Don't assume that just because a person is a person of color, that that person is on board with anti-racism. Be thoughtful when you consider which leadership. Look at their track record, look at the things that they've done, look at the words that have come from their mouth, look at whether or not they're aligned with the communities they claim to represent. Learn something about the history of white people who had worked for racial justice. And there's a long history and a long line. Find out what systems worked for them. Don't do it alone. It's okay to ask a colleague or a friend to join you in this fight. And talk to your children about and other young people about racism, because it starts with them. If we want to change the cycle, we have to start with the children. Some things that people of color said they've wanted from white allies: don't assume you know what's best for me. Don't make assumptions. Don't take it personally. This isn't an anti-white person movement. This is an anti-racism movement. Talk to other white people. Because you can go to spaces and places that I will never, ever traverse. There are spaces and places where Black people will never cross the doorway. That's your opportunity to be an ally in that case. Teach your children about racism. Interrupt the jokes and comments. Speak up. Don't ask me to speak for my people. I am no more the representative for all Black people than Britney Spears is the representative for all white people. Put your body on the line. Mine is every day, and persevere. We all get tired, and that's okay. I don't have the luxury of quitting. Respect us, listen to us, take risks, make mistakes. If the goal is to never get it wrong, you've already gotten it wrong. We're gonna have missteps, we're gonna have mistakes. The key is not to not make a mistake. The key is to acknowledge the mistake, take ownership of the mistake, and correct the mistake. The best apology is changed behavior. Find out about us, individually and collectively. Don't take over. Don't presume to take my voice. Stand by my side, provide information, provide resources, provide money, all of which aid in the fight against anti-racism. So here are some things you don't do when someone has experienced racial trauma. Don't dismiss or minimize someone else's experience. Practice compassion and empathy. Don't make it about you. It's not a personal attack. It may feel uncomfortable. It may raise some uncomfortable emotion. It's hard to hold space for someone when they're in pain. But it's important to make space for other people's pain without taking it on, or distracting from it, or running away from it. Don't make it their responsibility to educate you about racism. So when I talk about racism fatigue, I talk about this idea that ever since this Black Lives Movement has touched off, there's been this outpouring of a desire to understand racism in America. And primarily the sources that people tend to look to are the Black people. So in the midst of our own racial trauma, we then have to educate. It can be exhausting. Don't view Black people and people of color through the victim's lens. You know, here's the thing about being Black in America. Have we been through a lot? Absolutely, but we are still standing, we are still here. We survived slavery, Jim Crow, and we're still here. There's a certain amount of strength that's required to keep surviving. Not everyone is surviving as well. We are definitely battered, but we are not broken. For all Lives Matters friends, when Boston Marathon was bombed and everybody's profile picture changed, nobody said, from Boston Strong, nobody said all cities strong. After the Las Vegas shooting, it was stand with Vegas, not stand with everyone and everywhere. No one's countering a breast cancer post with, wait, what about colon cancer? It's not saying that other people's lives don't matter. It's saying that we are under fire right now. Our house is on fire. Can we focus on putting out the fire in our house? So in order to move from awareness and alliance to action, you have to leave the fear zone and enter the learning zone and go to the growth zone. The fear zone is about denial of racism and avoiding the hard truths about racism and not wanting to deal with the discomfort that comes with it. The learning zone is trying to understand and educate ourselves around racism so that we can be better equipped to deal with it. And then the growth zone is when we feel comfortable enough with what we know to actually speak out and step out and help to promote anti-racism and to advocate for people of color. I have one more video that I'd like to show you, and this is the last video of the day. And then I'm gonna go on to the self-care piece.
Until we understand the truth of our history, every effort at repair will fail. Most people ask the question, do you support reparations? Don't know what the word means. They think it's some check. There is no sufficient check you can put in the mail. It means something much more dynamic, much more inclusive, and much more substantial. After apartheid in South Africa, there was a recognition that they couldn't get to a healthy place without a commitment to truth and reconciliation. There were convenings where people who had been victimized by apartheid and discouraged and traumatized by that bigotry could have place to give voice to it. If you go to Johannesburg today, their constitutional court is surrounded by the emblems, the monuments, the symbols that are designed to make sure no one forgets the inequality of apartheid. In Rwanda, there was a recognition that the country couldn't recover from that horrific genocide without a process of truth and reconciliation, truth and repair, truth and justice. And you can't spend a day in Rwanda without people talking to you about the genocide. It's urgent to them that everyone understand what happened there. In Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers or monuments or stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans actually want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial. They're trying to change the narrative. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. Swastikas have been banned. There's a consciousness to never again fall prey to the politics of fear and anger that gave rise to that Holocaust. In this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about the Native genocide. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice and people are looking for exits. Our landscape is littered with iconography designed to romanticize the period of enslavement, to celebrate and honor the architects and defenders of slavery. People get very, very uncomfortable when you start talking about how we begin to deconstruct this legacy of bias and segregation. We talk about transitional justice in other places in the world. The State Department is even funded to assist in those efforts in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, but we've never done it in this country. And I think the time is now. In law school, you're taught if someone's rights are violated, there have to be remedies. And the remedies are shaped by the nature of the violation, which is understanding what the motives are, what the intent was, what's the extent of the injury is central to what kind of remedy you impose. And I think we have too many people in this country who want to talk about truth and repair or truth and reconciliation and truth and justice. And they want to skip the truth part and jump right to the reparation or reconciliation part. I don't think it works that way. It's the truth part that's actually the hard part. When we all have a consciousness of the truth, the repair part actually becomes so much easier. So I'm resistant to any effort to reduce the project in front of us to something that allows us to skip the truth. Most people in this country know nothing about what happened to African Americans in the first half of the 20th century when 6 million fled the American South as refugees and exiles. Most of us know nothing about the brutality of the domestic slave trade and the way thousands of African American families were pulled apart, where women were brutalized and raped, where men were reduced to objects, where children were sold away from their parents. And until we know those details, we can't appreciate what kind of remedy, what kind of repair is needed. I go into courts and jails, and my clients who've been convicted of crimes to be released have to go before a parole board typically, and they have to acknowledge the wrongfulness of their crime. And they do that because the parole board won't let them out if they still distrust them to acknowledge the wrongfulness of what they do. They don't trust people who aren't prepared to express remorse and regret. My clients need to do that to understand that wrongfulness so that they won't reoffend. I think the same is true for this nation. I think we have to articulate the wrong that was done. We have to express remorse and regret. We have to feel some of the shame that we should feel about this history of racial inequality. I want an era of truth and reconciliation in this country, truth and justice, truth and repair. I want to see what happened in South Africa and Rwanda and Germany happen here. I want the landscape to change. I want the iconography to change. I want all of these totems to the Confederacy and these false narratives to end. I want us to stop tolerating bigotry and bias in the workplace and the school place. I want something fundamental to happen. And then I want to experience something that feels more like freedom and equality and justice than we have experienced in this country today.
I think that video does a really good job of talking about all of the parts that are necessary to be racially trauma informed. Awareness and acknowledgement, and also working towards change to ally with Black Americans, and the actions that are needed to bring about systemic change. So something else to consider. Having learned what you learned today, when someone reports experiencing racism, how will you approach the situation differently? What steps or actions will you take? Well, we're towards the end of our presentation, and I want to first say thank you for taking the time and taking the opportunity to find out more. And let's talk about how we can take care of ourselves during these really ridiculously difficult times. So here are some tips for taking care of yourself during a collective crisis. Blocking out short periods of time for complete silence to hear your inner voice. That means stepping away if you need to, driving away if you need to, making time however you need to honor yourself and to spend time with you. Pause to feel what's coming up. Pay attention to what emotions are up for you. Journal them, name them, feel it. It's important not to try and push past the emotions. Spend time learning, researching, reflecting from people you resonate with. Having clear boundaries to protect yourself from being overloaded by everything that's going on. And that could include turning off the television, not watching the news, limiting your social media interaction, limiting your conversations with certain people. Spending time in nature, connecting with someone you love, practice your breath work, and prioritize rest and joy. You know, it's hard to find good things in everything that's going on, but we have to look for those moments of joy in order to have reasons to continue. We have to continue to look for those places of hope. Shout out to all my therapists of color who are working through and people of color in general, who are working through their own racial trauma, fear, and grief, while trying to continue to hold the light of hope for others. Remember, self-care is also choosing places where I don't have to regularly explain the nuances of my culture. For my folks out there who came today to take part in this presentation, it takes a special kind of person to push past their own fear, grief, and compassion fatigue to help calm others during a global crisis. For my mental health professionals out there, we see you, we need you, thank you for all you do. For my allies in general, thank you for all that you do. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you do better. So this is a period for question and comments if anyone has any, but before we go, I just want to run through the list of resources to let you know that there's lots of resources coming your way. So fear not. This may have felt like a master class in racism, but there's still a lot to learn and there's still a lot of ways to grow. So be the change you want to see in the world. Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. Again, I don't know how people were, you know, on my end, that there was a couple of triggers and experiences that I didn't expect this to still feel. So I'm thinking that, you know, the audience had some experiences as well. So thank you all for coming out. We're gonna do a Q&A real quick, but there's a couple of things I do want to run through. It was mentioned that the $5 membership fee, if anyone is not a member of NAMI, our Robin, our executive director for Nevada, she will pay that $5 fee for any of you who are interested in being a part of NAMI. So actually, we'll, you know, if I'm not mistaken, you'll just be enrolled and you'll have access and you'll be a part of NAMI. And then next year, it'll be up to you to continue on and things like that. So thank you, Robin, for offering that up. We really appreciate it. I think that's an awesome gesture for all that has joined this webinar. And then we are going to, real quick, we're going to take a couple minutes. We have several questions, it's about 5 questions. So we're going to do a quick poll of those questions. And so we'll leave the poll up for, let's say, 2 minutes. So you can answer those questions and then we'll go back through the poll. And then we'll jump into Q&A. So there was a few questions that were asked. If there are still questions, if you're interested in asking questions and things like that, please go in and type in your question so we can get an answer. Or if you have a question, we'll reach out and let you verbally ask that question of Dr. Crabb as well. So thank you, Dr. Crabb. And we're still moving here. So we have about 15 minutes to do this. So Trent, if you can post that poll and we'll go from there. And I do see the poll is up. So 2 minutes if we can have you guys answer those questions. And some of those questions are really talking about comfortability with talking about race and things like that. So, and I think Dr. Crabb, you have that available to you as well. So you'll be able to see, you should be able to see the answers and the polling and things like that.
I wanted to take a moment to clarify that the one statement about asking for help or stepping in with unrequested help. So when I'm talking about stepping in with unrequested help, I'm talking about this sort of a mythology around white savior that exists in popular culture. I'll send you some links around movies that involve it. So the idea isn't that Black people don't wish to receive assistance or help from allies or others. It's this idea that that person then becomes the focus versus the individual who needed it, or that person then presumes to be the voice of that Black person. It's like, it's okay, like, let me just, I got this. Let me explain this for you. Let me take care of this for you. There are going to be spaces and places where it's entirely appropriate for a person, for a white person or an ally to step in. You know, if you are the corporate executive at, you know, at the highest levels, you know, it's perfectly expected to advocate for people of color who work for your organization. It's perfectly acceptable to have conversations in those spaces and places where you exist. If I'm having a conversation, and I've actually had this happen where I'd start talking and someone goes, well, what she meant was, you know, as if I wasn't able to articulate my own points. You know, it isn't a question of being rescued. We need allies. We don't necessarily need someone else to take over. And I'm seeing a lot of this, I think, also in the protests, which is interesting. Like, I'm still not clear what the naked woman was about. Like, who is that for? Like, how is that helpful to, I mean, like, was that Black Lives? What was that? You know, I'm seeing a lot of situations where the message is being lost because the focus has shifted off of the people who the message is for. So I hope that clarifies a little bit around what I mean when I say that stepping in and offering assistance when it is not necessary or requested. It's in those moments where that person then becomes the focal point and takes away all the power from the person. It's much more helpful to help someone have the tools to advocate for themselves than to always have to be advocated for.
Thank you. I saw that question earlier, and that was a great response to that, or a great answer to that. Because again, that's one of the things that I think a lot of us battle with is when to step in, or when a friend steps in. And like you said, from the corporate environment, you know, it's when it's the hierarchy and you're lower on the pole, you would hope that somebody stepped in and said, hey, what you're doing is not right. This is wrong. That way it changes whatever the company culture, the family structure, or whatnot. You know, someone has to step in and say, this is not right. And then there's times where you can't speak for me, but thanks for that response, because that, again, I think a lot of us battle with that, you know, having friends step in, and when is it okay for a friend to step in that's not Black or whatnot. So
if ever it's a situation where I'm in jeopardy, please do step in.
Right.
Let me be really clear on that. Do not watch me be verbally, physically assaulted and then be like, well, this is not, you know, I can't, you know, perhaps it's not my place. Like, in those moments, we definitely need some form of intervention.
Exactly. There's another question towards the bottom there, and they're looking for any tips on discussing racial trauma and how to deal with it with children and preteens, and how does one approach that, especially for inner city children?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the resources that I was included is how to have conversations around race with children. And with children of color and Black children, it's particularly hard because you don't want to kill their hope. while at the same time you want to make sure that they're informed about the risks to them, which is kind of a difficult balance to have. I say that that's a conversation that's going to happen multiple times at multiple levels, depending on the level of the child. Like you wouldn't have the same conversation with a 5-year-old that you'll have with a teenager.
Right.
You know, with a 5-year-old, it's just around safety, and it's almost around being prepared to help them manage the emotions around being received the ways that they don't wish to be received. Because especially when it comes to microaggressions and racism, when you're young, it's really hard to understand why someone wouldn't just want to be your friend because of
Right. And those are things that we battle with. And even as adults, when you run into situations and you're thinking it's 2020, but there you run into that negative space, whether it's in the line at the grocery store or picking up your kids from school or whatnot. So, even going down the hierarchy of adult to teenager to child, we all could use a level of understanding, even in 2020 as an adult. I still question, like, really, you know what I mean? So imagine kids, like you said, not being accepted for color or whatnot, or a 5-year-old not being allowed to play or interact. So these are all huge things that that aligns with. So real quick, we're going to run through this poll real quick, which I thought was pretty interesting, just going through. So appreciate everybody who took the poll. It looks like 29 of you did it. So on a scale, and I know we only have about 8 minutes, so I'm going to try to get through this. How comfortable are you talking about race or racism? So it looked like 3, so the highest was 12%, and I'm sometimes uncomfortable talking about it. So maybe we can we'll go through all these real quick, and then Dr. Crabb, if you want to address a couple of these, that way we can talk about, because that was a high one, 12% of the 29 are sometimes uncomfortable about talking about race. How comfortable are you talking about racism in private setting? 5, it looks like that ranked at number 5, and I am very comfortable talking about racism. So that's really good. That's 15%. 52%, 15 people answered that question. And I'm sorry about that first one, that was actually 41%. And then number 3, how comfortable are you talking about racism with your colleagues? So that ranked at 29%, 8 people. I am usually comfortable to talk about racism. So that's actually really good. I'm surprised at the number of comfort, as far as comfort level. And then number 4 was comfortable. How comfortable are you talking about racism with those you serve in your field? So that actually was a tie at 28%. So I'm usually comfortable talking about racism, and then I am very comfortable talking about racism. So, man, these numbers as far as comfort level, I think that's a really great sign. And then last one, when you have discussed matters related to race or racism, how often have you initiated the conversation? So about half the time, 19 people answered that, at 66% of the total. So these are all great numbers. Is there any one of these that you feel like you want to comment on or add to?
That is super exciting. I'm so glad to see those numbers, and I'm hoping that the conversations continue to happen, because that's the only way change happens. So the public settings one is a little bit challenging, I think, simply because it sort of requires putting yourself on the line in places, and also now, especially around issues of safety. I don't know why people felt sometimes comfortable and sometimes not, but I can think for myself personally, when I consider safety and safe spaces and all the things that have been going on around racism publicly, it's a pretty terrifying landscape out there.
Right.
Terrifying landscape, but just something to consider when you think about talking about racism publicly. This doesn't mean like confronting dude at the grocery store in a SWAT sticker mask. It doesn't have to be that. It could be something as simple as the policies around your organization. If you have an opportunity to advocate and speak, and do you do it?
Right.
It can even be in terms of social media. A lot of people's social media pages are on lockdown, but a lot of people also belong to different groups.
Right.
Moms in private practice being one of them, or psychologists of color, and a host of other groups. those are kind of public-private settings as well, because you have a relationship with them, but you don't know all those people on your pages. So when it comes to speaking publicly, it's not required that you stand on the Empire State Building and proclaim that you're not racist.
Right, right.
Opportunities present themselves, that you take that opportunity to be more vocal about your position, which we don't always do because we're worried about perception.
Right.
Or getting arguments with people on social media.
Right, which is interesting, and that has been something that has been somewhat of a battle, because you grow up, some of us grew up in suburban areas and things like that, and your number of Caucasian or white friends is high. So the interesting part is that I'm seeing people express themselves in ways that I've never experienced, and these are people that I grew up with around their family, and I'm like, I had no idea. So, as, a person of color, Black male in America, it's unfortunate, but you're exposed to things that you would never thought you'd have to deal with. So unfriending someone or seeing someone express themselves. And I don't want to take away that expression from them, but at the same time, I'm subject to that. I had no idea they were or they thought that way. You know what I mean? So that's the hard part. And I think it happens for a lot of us. When it comes down to people sharing their true opinions about things and things like that. So there's another question in the Q&A. So what does that conversation look like with juniors, seniors who are well informed of the way the world sees them, yet I want them to be able to be empowered to push forward anyway?
So I'm really glad you asked that question, because as a mom of a teen boy, well, not teen, I guess he's technically grown because he's not. But as a mother of a grownish person, one of the things that we really had to work on and continue to work on is enforcing his sense of self, so that the things that the world thinks about him don't then translate into the things that he thinks about himself. And it's funny because it's little random ways of exposure that you wouldn't even consider. It's about the programs that we watch. It's about the conversations that we have. It's about infusing historical facts that come from a point of pride. A lot of the narrative around being Black is suffering and sadness and past.
Right, that's a true story.
Black Panther was everything to me. We were powerful, we were successful, we were in advanced technology,
right?
We were healthy, and it wasn't like 1,000 years ago. So a lot of that is thinking about the narrative that we put forward for him, and making sure that he has examples of strong, successful, healthy Black people that aren't just like athletes or entertainers. No disrespect to them, but let's be honest, when it comes to who we know in the Black community that is successful, we can't name millionaires, entrepreneurs.
Right.
Black community, I can name like 5 of them. So the exposure to different aspects of Blackness, paying attention to what he's consuming in terms of media, and trying to include him in watching shows that have positive messages, trying to reinforce the Blackness so that it can withstand the racism. And having conversations when I notice things in the movie like, hey, did you notice X, Y, and Z happened? So that racism is a topic that's talked about in your home openly, and that he can express feelings around it.
Right.
One of my recommendations is just having those, and not having it dominate the landscape, because that's the other thing, is that racism being such a hot topic, it's like, I need to tell him. And we're looking at it through our own trauma lens. Mm-hmm. So we need to be able to have the conversations without traumatizing them based on our trauma. That's not trauma.
Right. And that's the hard part, because again, when you're rearing children and you're wanting them, I tell people all the time, I felt like I was raised to survive. So there were certain things that I was taught. And although there were some things that was said that was traumatic now that I look back at it, but at the same time, as I saw things, happen in the world, I'm like, this is what they were talking about. So sometimes you do have to ask yourself, how much do you give, or, how much do you inform, because you don't want them to also have the extra stuff, right? So you're like, I don't want you to forecast too much, but I want you to look out for certain things. So, I mean, what you're saying is now that I think about it as an adult and remembering what my parents did for me, you make a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense.
And it depends on where they are in terms of their own emotional levels. There are conversations you can have with a 20-year-old that you can't have with a 10-year-old.
Oh, that's so true. So
Just
true.
the conversation to the child, you know.
Right. Right. You don't want to traumatize a 10-year-old.
Spoon feed them the racism.
Right.
When they get up, when they're grown, just
right.
A whole cup right now.
Right. Let's see here. It looks like looks like another question just popped up, and then we'll end it with this. Because it looks like, I don't know if it's going to cut us off, so I don't know how much time we have over the 1:30. But are there times when aspects of a strength-based model are used too prematurely? When can validating racial trauma as a therapist be considered unhealthy? And great lectures. So they're also telling you great lecture.
Thank you. So in terms of the strength-based model, I guess it depends on how you use it. Like, you don't want to, that strong Black woman thing, you don't want to overestimate someone's ability to cope with something by saying, but yeah, your people survived all these years, I'm sure you're fine. We want to make room for people to be human and to be vulnerable in those spaces. But we also don't want to set the stage where they're perpetually viewing themselves as not able to move past those things. I like the idea of battered, not broken. It's okay that this world is going to slap you around if you're Black. It just is, literally and metaphorically.
Right.
So that's to be expected and that's to be understood. But we also have a history of resilience. We don't all come through the same way, and resilience looks different for different people. Recovery looks different for different people. Post-traumatic growth looks different for different people. For some people, the fact that they are still standing on this earth is resilience. For others, it means that they have excelled to the highest levels. So I like the strength-based model because it instills hope in my mind, but we don't want to drag someone through a gate. If that person is not emotionally in that place, let's not tell them that they're stronger than they are. Let's talk about how to get stronger. Because becoming stronger is an option.
Right.
The other thing about invalidating, I couldn't remember. I didn't remember that last part. There's something about validating.
Let's see here. When can validating racial trauma as a therapist be considered unhealthy?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question, because the answer of how do I discuss race in the therapy room? So I would like to say that it's okay to talk about the elephant in the room. It's not okay to force somebody to ride the elephant. Like, you can have a conversation and say, I'm curious as to how you're being impacted by the things that are happening. And if they say, I'm cool, I don't want to talk about that this week, then that's fine. It's not like, well, but I'm sure you must be traumatized by what's happening, because maybe they're not in a space or place, or maybe they haven't fully processed emotions around it. So it's okay to acknowledge it and even bring it up.
Right.
But it's not okay to force someone to talk about it if they're not ready to talk, just like any other trauma.
Right.
Like any other trauma. Acknowledge it exists, maybe even make some connection to what they're experiencing in relationship to the trauma, but don't force them to unpack their trauma, especially considering in the therapeutic space is a power differential. And let's be honest, I don't know you. You don't know me. I'm going to take my whole life.
Right.
Like 2 weeks ago.
Right.
So, just having a little humility around the conversations regarding trauma, and knowing that people have to get comfortable enough to share in those spaces.
Right.
They know that they have permission to share, there's a greater likelihood they will.
Right. And that's something that it's funny, because having, a multicultural clientele, there has been where, African-American or Black male, child or adolescent. And it's interesting because they're not necessarily fully affected in the way that I'm affected. So when I ask the question, so how are you dealing with, and they're like, no big, it's almost like no big deal. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, good. And I'm like, and I do say, well, if there's anything that you, feel like you want to talk about in regards to this, later on, that's okay. Just, let me know. But, I'm not going to force it either. Like, you sure you don't feel bad? You don't feel, disrespected? I'm not going to do that. But, again, another great question, because these are the things that having, you know, different clients of different culture and things like that. And of course, in this difficult time in America, that's, you know, one of the things is that, you know, are your clients affected by what's going on? And if they are, let's talk about it if you want to. And if they're not, it's okay. We don't have to, you know, go into that because you know, if it's not affecting you in that way. So,
the responses when you ask questions, and pay attention to the signs and symptoms that they may be affected and may not even recognize the way.
Right. So I see that there's no other questions. It looks like we've answered most of them. I do know that we are going to be posting the recorded video. I find out about the slides. So I don't know if Trin, if you want to jump on real quick, and that way we can kind of close things out.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Crabb. We so appreciate all the information and the insight that you've offered us. I've definitely learned a lot and had to take a step back and reflect on all those questions that you shared for myself. And so we will be sending out an email. Send out an email with a list of resources that Dr. Crabb provided at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. And we'll make the recording available on YouTube. And Dr. Crabb, is it okay if we make the slides available as well? Send out. Okay, so we'll be sending out the slides out along with the resources as well. So again, thank you so much for everyone attending today. Thank you, Milton, for moderating with the questions. Great questions from everyone. We are looking forward to hopefully continue this discussion because, as you said, Dr. Crabb, this isn't just a one-time thing. You can't cover, you know, racism or racial trauma in just an hour and a half. So we'll look forward to continuing this discussion, future presentations or events that we hold. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Hey, and before you go, thank you so much, Dr. Crabb. We really appreciate you again. This was something that, you know, from a mental health perspective and NAMI, it really just fit with what we do here. And so I so thank you and appreciate you for what you've done. And then everybody who attended, I know there's 23 people left. I just want to thank you for taking the time. It's an hour and a half out of your day, out of your time. And so you've sacrificed that time to get something new and learn. So thank you guys so much, and hopefully we'll see you soon in other events that we have going on. Thanks again, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.